Travis pointed out, I am Klaus Benjamin Freinger, faculty here at UCLA for a little over 8 years now, which is hard to believe, but true. And conveniently, also a graduate of the MArc 1 program. So I was sitting where you are not too many years ago, or maybe it was actually a lot of years ago. I won't tell you when because it's frankly embarrassing, but I will say that this process is familiar to me. I've seen the portfolios both on the admissions side and on the administrative side and as an applicant. So I certainly appreciate what everyone is kind of is up against and the questions that I'm sure are going to be coming, and I'll do my very best to answer them in as great a detail as I can. So having said that, the format of this presentation is rather informal. What we're going to do is run through a portfolio. It's actually 11 portfolios that we've selected from previous applicants to UCLA AUD from a variety of backgrounds. As you know, what makes this place unique is that we have incoming students with backgrounds ranging from fine arts backgrounds to bachelor's in architecture to bachelor's in any kind of field in the humanities you can imagine, and even some master's candidates who are choosing a different direction and pursuing architecture. So you're in good company and with a very diverse group, which we kind of think is one of the strengths of the program around here. So um, with that said, I'll take you through some portfolio samples. Again, workshop is maybe a bit of a misnomer. This is more of an info session. So we'll try to get through kind of some portfolios, and I'll narrate a little bit as we go. So uh, first portfolio, this is going to be an undergraduate portfolio, and you can see that there's quite a bit of sort of relatively high level work that's been produced in an undergraduate program for architecture. So this is what I would call kind of an architecture heavy portfolio. Although we have some different examples of like fine arts and art specific related projects that are of interest here. So that is to say, you don't need to show architecture. If you haven't studied architecture, it's important to know that what the admissions committee is looking for, and then what we are trying to achieve in this process is an understanding of your capacity to function as an architecture student and learn architecture. So you don't have to know it already. It's more important that you tell a compelling story and be able to establish kind of a consistency between that story that you're telling and your application materials. So we understand that there's a way of thinking, a way of operating that will make you a successful architecture student and a successful, perhaps practitioner, whether you end up practicing architecture or not. That your way of thinking and your capacity to kind of solve problems and reason your way through the academic, like the rigors of the academy here at UCLA, will allow you to succeed as a student. That's a really long-winded way of saying we just want to know you're smart and like architecture. Um, so this is another portfolio that shows some kind of fine arts work, current student at UCLA, and including some glass blowing examples. Again, just to illustrate the sort of range and diverse array of different backgrounds. This is something a little bit more specific to architecture, with a background in architecture from a university abroad. Down to fine arts and graphic design again, and something more specific to architecture. In this case, I believe a UCLA undergraduate. So again, what's the story? How are you telling that story? And how can your portfolio work in support of a broad range of application materials, including an essay? For me, the litmus test of a successful portfolio is that it acts as a complement to that narrative, to your writing materials. You're going to confront a lot of writing requirements in architecture, meaning that you have to describe your work. It can't solely exist on the walls without explanation. So how you communicate that work graphically and support it with a consistent narrative is incredibly important. Oh, we're stuck a little bit. Let's see if we can unstuck. There we go. So in any case, I'm going to keep cycling through, and I tend to think that the most productive thing for us to do is to go right into questions and see if there's any questions that we can answer for you. If you have any further thoughts or comments, that would be, I think, the most important thing. So if you want, as we said, we're happy to have you post questions in chat. You can also unmute and verbalize your questions. It's not just one format.
I had a quick question.
Mhm.
So, given that we're working within kind of a page count restriction, are you guys going to look down upon a portfolio that doesn't prioritize putting a table of contents and kind of just go straight into it?
Um, I'm glad we're actually looking at this particular portfolio. This is like a really good example of like a very clear table of contents. This portfolio is telling us like what we might expect in terms of the content, at least like the graphic language that we're to expect in the portfolio. And then it's breaking down precisely what's coming. I think that's a very good way to break down information in your portfolio. It's not the only way. An analogy that I kind of frequently use is that your portfolio, like so many things architectural, should operate at a variety of scales. Meaning, there are some things that I should get immediately at a large scale, and some things that maybe require additional attention or a further look. And it's your capacity to kind of lead with those things that will catch our attention and then follow up with things that will require or potentially just support a closer look at the material. It means that when you kind of imagine this as being reviewed by a committee and a room full of people or one person individually who has to look at a lot of these. You want there to be a hook. You want there to be something that catches everyone's attention, and then an intro and a supporting narrative. It's set up just like a piece of writing. And the clearer that transition is from the opening pages, the title, the hook, down to the most granular information, the better. Whether that's a table of contents or another graphic organization, like hierarchical graphic organization. This slide is a good example. There's like a larger image that describes like a larger scene. And then there's supporting material, and we break things down further. These are all pretty good examples. So different ways of doing it. What else? There must be more questions. I know there are.
Hi, I was wondering just what advice you could share for students who are putting together a portfolio but don't come from an architecture background. For example, I did my undergrad in economics, but most of the work that I'm going to be showing in my portfolio are going to be like chef knives that I made throughout the years, furniture projects, and construction projects that I've worked on. I was just
Mhm.
wondering what advice you can share for presenting those in a way that is like visually good.
It's a broad question, but I'll do my best. I would say that construction projects are great. You have some experience that's always a benefit. It will allow you to function in graduate school, like understanding some of the tools and maybe even understanding the way of thinking related to architecture. Um, but writing is great. If there is a way for you to graphically present writing examples, that is, yes, about the content of the writing, but more so maybe about the way that you are presenting that information and your capacity to kind of organize it in a creative way graphically, I would think that's pretty important. And maybe something that I would even lead with in lieu of trying to load a lot of specifically architecture related things like construction related work to the front. Now, having said that, I think there's room for both of those to coexist. It's how you would kind of relate the two vis-a-vis your writing and in the content of your portfolio that I think would become really important. I hope that's not too ambiguous. I can point my comments a little bit more if you want to expand your question a little bit.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. I know that like there's generally like a norm in portfolios around not having too much writing, but is it fair to say that that is less the case for students who don't have an architecture or fine arts background?
Absolutely. We're going to see that you don't have an architecture background and venture to look a little bit further and in a little more nuanced way at what you're presenting and why that might be relevant to your application.
I noticed the specification was that it has to be 8.5 by 11. Is what you're showing us like two different pages put together, or is this how they actually
This,
submitted?
this is just a layout that's more suited to kind of a this particular format,
Okay.
right? So you should absolutely follow the format that's prescribed in the application.
Hi, I have
We
a
have
quick
a
question.
few questions in the chat or in the Q&A that I can read off. So I'll start from the top. Sorry, Dylan, to cut you off. I'll let you go first, actually.
Go for it, Dylan.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I come from a non-architecture background, and I've currently laid out my portfolio in a chronological narrative to kind of describe how I've landed to the decision to pursue architecture. But as a result, my like strongest work and most recent work is at the back of the portfolio. Would you say that's a problem, or do you have any recommendations on how you could maybe organize that to lead with something stronger, or would that be understood by the committee that there's sort of a story being told?
So you're trying to represent a chronology, like how you've kind of landed in architecture and your process through architecture, and you have a non-architectural background.
Right.
Dylan, if you had an architectural background and you started with an undergraduate degree or you switched majors and you worked up to architecture and then progressed in the field, I might, and I'm going out on a limb here a little bit, you can take this advice, take it or leave it, and of course go a different direction. But if you were sort of in a capacity to um, lead with the strongest work, that's what I would think is best. It There may have been a journey leading up to architecture, but your journey is only going to get much, much longer, and it's frankly endless. In our industry, the learning curve is steep, and it goes on for a long, long time, starting before graduate school and well after. So for me, it would be less about arriving at where you are now, but about assembling a kind of a series of credentials and ideas that support the argument for why you are a good candidate for architectural studies at a graduate level. So if the strong work is important, then maybe taking kind of a bit of advice from what I mentioned earlier about like scaling certain things up and making them more present in the portfolio compared with other things, that
Hmm.
would be a way to organize that. You could also do it chronologically and rely on scale to bring things to the foreground and use like tricks of scale and representation to show what things you really want to draw attention to.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Ben, we have a question that says, how important is it to show process in portfolio projects? And do you have any advice on how to show process?
Um, we're on a good slide for that. So what we have is an undergraduate project for a house, and then on the left is a model. Like basically, I would call that the final output. That's where the student ended. And then to the right is a series of diagrams that illustrate like what's the big idea. How does this work? It's a knot, right? It's two knots translated into a geometric language that produce this conceptual house. That I would say is like as a really good, this is a really good version of process. It's not so much about saying, I did this, and then I did this, and then I did this, and telling us a story about how you worked your way through the project. It's about pointing to relevant milestones or key moments that underpin what conceptually you were up to and what it is you're trying to achieve. So when confronting process versus concept, I would always lean more on concept versus process. Having said that, if you've manufactured a series of like beautiful objects using a CNC mill and a bunch of resin casts are the result, and there's a lot of beautiful content, show it. Just be mindful of how you show that and that it supports the end game, what you're trying to communicate to us as the viewers of your portfolio.
The next question is, what balance do you recommend between showing our professional and school projects?
I tend to think that the school projects, with very few examples, are a better indicator of kind of the potential of a student at the graduate level. It's one thing to show projects for work, and there are some exceptions, and show that you have competence in a particular set of skills. It's another thing to show that you can ideate, that you can make an idea, put it forward, and execute it on your own to produce a cohesive project, which would be more in line with a student project compared with a professional project. So I personally would lean more heavily on the student work. Of course, you would have to kind of take that under consideration on a case-by-case basis.
And the next question is, are there any hard no's while putting together a portfolio?
I would say there are no hard no's. I will just caution that statement by saying, look at it with your eyes. You want to put a lot of information into this. At the end of the day, you should look at it and make sure that all of that information adds up to a legible story and doesn't simply exist in there because you want to contain it all in your portfolio. That sounds like, of course, that's what I would do. And of course, I'm going to look at it with my eyes. But I think you would be surprised when you spend a lot of time on something that you kind of lose your ability to see things objectively. I think it's also useful to get feedback from people who may have an eye for it and also people who may not have an eye for this, because you'll find that the layperson who is maybe not interested in architecture at all will have some smart and interesting things to say about what it is you're trying to communicate and whether it's clear.
Thanks. And then we have a few actually in the chat. I think I'd like to mention that if folks can maybe put questions in the Q&A, that might be helpful to make sure we don't lose track of them. So if it's not on your Zoom ribbon right now, you can press more, it should be there. Thanks, everyone. So the next question in the chat is, how many projects should be presented and the min or max pages?
It's a very difficult question to answer. I've seen anywhere from, 4 to 8 projects up to 10 projects. I think when you start getting above 10 projects, you're more than likely packing a lot of content into a really tight frame. I would be wary of that. I think I don't want to say less is more per se, but I think that really making some difficult choices about what's relevant and what to show, but showing those things very well and allowing the reading of those things to be very clear, that's important. So hierarchy and making some choices about what it is you think is relevant to talk about is important.
You. And then the next question is, should design process include written captions to further clarify details, or would just drawings/diagrams work?
You always want to include written captions. You're seeing it on a lot of these examples. Now, the important thing is not to overwhelm the work with writing, but writing is an integral part of all of this. You have to communicate your ideas and underpin them with like mini narratives. So that could be just a drawing title. A longer narrative could be an intro for a particular project that we may or may not read. Now, we want to understand your project graphically, but we want to ideally be able to go in, read, understand what's important, and really dissect it at a more granular, very precise level when we want to and when we need to.
Great. The next question we have in the chat is there a proper way to present projects one may have worked on as an intern or in a group setting, or are those best left out if one is not the sole author? I would
Be
also recommend
transparent.
this question
Yep, I think that's a
to,
great question. Be transparent about the work that you worked on this. Um, who is the employer? This was a group project. What was your role? Employer, the fact that it was a group project or a collaboration, and what was your role? Or if it was a school project, and it would be the studio title, for instance, who was the instructor, and the just acknowledging that it was group work and that you were part of a team. It was a collaborative effort.
thanks, and those are all the questions we have for now. So if folks have other questions, please type them in the chat or the Q&A, and or feel free to just unmute yourself and speak up. Thanks.
Yeah, we can just open it up and see if anyone wants to chime in and ask any questions out loud. Happy to do so.
Ben, we have one that says, if I have a written capstone paper, should I include it as a written sample? How long should a written sample be?
It's a really good question. I don't know that I would submit that a portfolio is the right format for a longer written piece. If you're putting a book together and the graphic content and the way that that book is organized is relevant or is interesting or somehow describes it's just relevant to its content and describes how you're working on that project, I think that's relevant. If it's a paper or a writing piece, more than likely it should find another place in your application. If not, just as a in your essay and supporting materials where you ultimately tell us like your capacity to write and produce that kind of work. And of course, in your CV or where the equivalent where you would show, you would kind of point to any samples of written material. And you may make those available upon request so that somebody who is eager to read or look a bit further has the capacity to click on a link and download the full text and read it.
Suchana, your hand is up.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear.
Alright. I wanted to ask, like, I guess through like admissions and such, do you tend to see what people sort of like personal work or like various like mediums like painting? Because I was quite curious that I like to do like henna design, so like I was like curious to think of like including it in the portfolio since it's like another version, uh, like another like medium.
In addition to architecture, or do you have an architectural background, just to be specific?
I actually have a landscape architecture background.
Got it. I think if it's relevant, you should show it. I mean, I applied to graduate school with a fine arts portfolio, large format drawings. So nothing related to architecture, even though I had professional experience in architecture. I chose to like really focus on the things that I thought best communicated my potential capacity as a student.
Thank you.
We have a question asking, is including a brief about me section recommended?
I think that is probably better represented in your application materials outside the portfolio. We should kind of know who you are by the time we get to the portfolio. This is about what you make as a reflection of who you are.
Ben, I wanted to mention that it looks like we have a smaller view of your presentation right now.
Got it?
So if we want to maybe switch it to a different view real quick.
Better?
Still the same.
Let me just be what we've got right now. Okay. Great.
Okay, we have another question. Should our CVs be traditionally formatted, or should there be effort made graphically that matches our portfolios?
You can kind of match things up. I don't know that they will be seen side by side. There's kind of like that. I mean, they might. I would kind of err on the side of keep the CV simple, make it do what it should do best, which is kind of communicate your history, your information, personal information, your work experience, and let the portfolio do the visual graphic kind of talking. It kind of tends to get a bit clever when those two become like too closely related. The CV will suffer as a CV, and you might catch yourself making compromises in the portfolio to make the format sync up that you wouldn't necessarily want to make. In the service of kind of making a cohesive whole, which may not actually be viewed that way consistently.
Thank you. And then the next question is, as a current illustration student, would it be okay if my portfolio has more illustrations, drawings, and paintings, especially digital illustrations?
The answer is yes, of course. Like that, if that is the cornerstone of your application and who you are and the strengths of you as an applicant, then that should be front and center in your portfolio.
Thanks. And then the next one is, do you view having little to no physical model images a hindrance to my portfolio?
That's a good question. If you have a background in architecture and you aren't showing any models, I would be a little bit suspect. And I'm a big fan of models, so I probably have a bias. But um, I would think that they should make an appearance. If for some reason that's just not how you work, or that's how you've made your way through any particular curriculum, there might be exceptions to that. So it's hard for me to make a blanket statement. But if you're not, obviously, if you don't have an architecture background, then I think there's no reason to assume that you would have any models in your portfolio. So it's a little bit different in both cases. But if you've worked on them, I would show them. I think it's a good idea.
So the next question is, were all the portfolios presented in letter size format?
I believe, yes, we covered that, that there's like a very specific guideline for the portfolios. You should follow it.
Dominic, feel free to unmute yourself.
Hi. I have an architecture background, and for one of my projects, I used AI for a generative like beginning process to help model forming and whatnot. But I was just curious if you had any tips to properly citing maybe the tools that we used in the preliminary exercises for AI.
Um, I think you would just want to acknowledge that AI contributed and in what way specifically.
Okay. Gotcha. Thank you.
In the chat, Sabrina asks, how does admissions compare to architectural studies majors compared to architecture majors?
That's more of an admissions question. I'm going to have a hard time answering that. I would encourage you um, to write admissions and ask those questions. Maybe my colleagues on the in Zoom here have a little bit more to say about that. It can point you in the right direction. But that's a difficult one for me to answer.
Let's see. Kay asks, are there any resources you can provide for the graphic design of the portfolio? My portfolio looks perfectly fine, but I love some hard and fast rules to go by uh, regarding layout so that I'm not committing any major graphic design faux pas.
That's a tough one. There are so many good resources online. I would just occasionally institutions publish samples. I don't know that we publish a sample formally. Justin, you might correct me, but I don't believe that we do.
I
But
don't
I
think so.
think that there are some pretty good examples. I would look for similar versions. You want to be looking at portfolios that represent applications to graduate level programs, not applications for postgraduate work in the professional space, not applications for undergraduate, things that relate specifically to your application and what you're applying for.
Next, Carlos asks, what softwares did these portfolios examples use if you are aware of any?
So there's a variety of softwares that are used. The basics in graduate school still tend to be Rhinoceros for digital modeling and also digital drawing. Adobe Illustrator, Adobe Photo, like anything in the Adobe suite is relevant. And then for layouts, InDesign, and if you want to embed video content, there's lots of different versions and ways of doing that. But I don't know that embedding video content in the portfolios digitally is a great idea. It tends to make the files really drag, and you can make a safe assumptions that they will be viewed digitally, but I'm not certain that video content will always be looked at. And they tend to crash out and air out. So that's kind of the basics. And Behance too. Yep. I just noticed something in the chat about other good portfolio samples. So I'm just calling it out. Sorry.
Hi. Do you have any thoughts on if it's important to show mostly recent work and really represent what you've been doing more recently, or is it cool to show older projects? Like I have a project from undergrad that's almost like 10 years ago at this point that I think would be cool, but and somewhat relevant, but I guess I'm kind of worried that it feels like it's old and somewhat irrelevant to who I am right now.
I think there's a difference between old and irrelevant to who you are right now. So I would make a distinction between if you think it communicates who you are as a candidate, you should absolutely include it. If it feels dated, own that. Make it clear that depending on how you organize it, of course, it will show when you made it. If you think it's relevant, I would show it. If you're only worried about it sort of haven't fallen out of style. I would worry about that less and more about what it says about you as a candidate. Any other questions?
We have another one from Suchana. Coming from landscape architecture, would including construction drawings be good?
Absolutely. I think if the content is beautiful and it communicates work that you've produced, show it. This is a question in the Q&A. What should the ratio of individual projects, group projects, and professional projects be? Um, I don't think there's a magic recipe, but I do think that if you were only showing group work, we may look at the portfolio and ask, I wonder what this person is capable of individually. So while I think you can have any kind of combination, I think it's important to show a range. At least some group work, some individual work. If you did no group work and it's only individual, I imagine that's just fine. But I would be a little bit suspect of only showing group work, as it might not clearly explain who you personally are as well as individual work would.
I'm trying to go through some questions we've received through email, just on the admission side, and I do think a vast majority or a good amount of them are asking about coming from a non-architecture background. So I know you've already spoken a bit about that, Ben, but is there anything else you can offer about maybe students who don't have writing work like you suggested, or other things they can do or programs they can take? I know, like for example, UCLA, our department, we have a Jumpstart program in the summertime that is highly recommended if you come from a non-architecture background and give you kind of some tools and experience to get your foot in the door. But if you have any other things in mind.
Yeah, I can't really think of anything special. I think the Jumpstart programs, like our Jumpstart program and other equivalents, are a great way just to more related to your success as a student in graduate school, to have a chance to really hone your skills and practice. Now, if you're producing work that you're proud of and you think is important, I think you should absolutely show it from one of those programs. But I would point to them more in terms of kind of what you would do to prepare for graduate school at large, and less about what they can do for your portfolio. As far as the kind of content of work, I mean, I've seen beautiful portfolios that contain creative writing examples where the layout itself was uh, like had a very architectural character and frankly just was graphically well organized, beautifully considered, and can communicate as much about a candidate's capacity to work or think architecturally as showing a whole sample of like highly developed architectural projects from an undergraduate program. So the structure of the portfolio itself is relevant. I just want to keep coming back to that and say, this is a story. It's a story about you and the clarity and consistency of that story and your ability to tell us how you can function in graduate school and that you have a capacity to operate in a graduate environment in an architectural school. That's that's what's important here. So the document itself is relevant and how it's put together, not just the content. For my part, maybe even more relevant in some cases. Great. So with that, if there are any more questions, I encourage you to reach out to any of our, got a lot of resources to reach out to any of, or to use any of those resources. And I hope